This is video 3 of our photosynthesis series, and this one will pick up right where I left off in video 2. We're talking about the how of photosynthesis, and I'll be using something we call the Z scheme to look at the energy state of electrons through the light-dependent process of photosynthesis. So this is some terms that will help us when we look at the Z scheme. Number 1, photoexcitation, the transfer of energy from light to form a high energy state of a molecule. We see photoexcitation occurring in the antenna pigments. So those antenna pigments become excited and they transfer that energy to the reaction pair of chlorophyll molecules in photosystems 1 and photosystems 2. We talked about the oxidation and reduction reactions that are occurring in photosynthesis. We see a oxidation reaction occurring with our chlorophyll reaction center. They donate electrons to the first set of electron acceptors, and then we see a whole series of oxidation and reduction reactions happening through that electron transfer. Photolysis, this is where a water molecule is split to donate electrons to the oxidized reaction center chlorophyll molecules. This is happening in that oxygen evolving complex that we saw back in video 2. And then photophosphorylation, the conversion of ADP to ATP using energy from the sun occurring through chemiosmosis. So this is occurring because we have that proton gradient, or the H plus gradient, inside the lumen space versus outside in the stroma. So we have higher concentration of protons in the lumen and a lower concentration in the stroma. So this is a cartoon of what we call the Z scheme. I'm saying the letter Z as in Z. And it's called the Z scheme, but you kind of have to turn your head sideways to see the actual Z. So maybe N scheme might make more sense, but it's called the Z scheme. And the numbers I have blocked out here on the Z scheme are an opportunity for you to think about what's happening at each point. So at number 1, from those terms that we just discussed, what do you think is happening here? What term might you use? So I'm going to give you 30 seconds to look at this and see if you can think about what term might be most appropriate from that list. And actually I would add a term. I maybe would add electron transport chain or electron transfer to that list. And can you use that list of terms and fill in each of those little boxes? And note, I'm just giving you a little pause time here to think about this. That's why this is sort of silent. Okay, let's see where you got. So number 1 from that list we could probably say is photoexcitation. So these are our accessory pigments, or excuse me, our antenna pigments. They can pick up wavelengths of light from the visible spectrum. They become excited from that, and they are able to transfer that energy to this reaction pair of chlorophyll molecules in our photosystem 2. Number 2, we could actually say oxidation or reduction, couldn't we? Because we know that the reaction pair is oxidized and the accepting pair is reduced. Number 3, this is showing us that water molecule being split. So number 3 would be photolysis. Number 4 is showing us a series of electron transfers. And so actually that is technically a series of oxidation reduction reactions, but we could also call it an electron transfer chain. This one's a little obscure, number 5. But you can see here this ATP, this actually represents photophosphorylation, where we've taken advantage of that proton gradient and we're able to use that potential energy to phosphorylate ADP to ATP. Number 6, we're over at photosystem 1, and if we're thinking about the energy state of the electron, remember we said this is the Z scheme because it shows us the energy state of the electron through the process. Here we started at, a low energy state. The electrons became excited through this sunlight energy, and then through a series of electron transfers, we're gleaning the energy from that excited electron. We're back at a low energy state at photosystem 1. They become through photoexcitation, that electrons are re-energized, and then we go through an oxidation reduction reaction when we reduce NADP plus to NADPH in number 8. So we have oxidation reduction, or you could say electron transfer, and then oxidation reduction in number 8. And this is in the Prezi, so you can go back and look at this for yourself, but this is just the completed table, kind of showing some of the details that I left out when I was asking you to think about it for yourself. But again, this is a little bit different way of thinking about the light-dependent reaction. It is really looking more at the how, and we're looking at that how by looking at the energy state of the electrons moving through the light-dependent reaction. And then finally I'm going to spend a little bit of time on Calvin cycle, or the light-independent reactions of photosynthesis. And I really don't spend as much time on the light-independent reactions as we do on the light-dependent reactions. We'll just do a summary of these. In the light-independent reactions, we take the high-energy molecules that we created in the light-dependent reactions, and we use those to fix CO2 from the atmosphere into a biologically usable form of carbon for the plants. And we know some things about this already because we've talked about it. We know where it occurs. Remember, we know that this occurs in the stroma. When does it occur? This is a little bit of a tricky question. We call these light-independent reactions, and in fact they used to be called the dark reactions. So sometimes people got confused and they thought, oh, this just happens at night, or it just happens in the dark, and they got confused. Well, if you think about it, this is sort of a limiting reaction, isn't it? So we have to have those products from the light reactions. If we don't have the products from the light reactions, we probably won't be having the light-independent reactions occurring. Now, there's some plants that have found ways to overcome this, and we might get into that later in the semester. But for the most part, we need to have those products from the light reaction in order for this to occur. And then what reactants are required for this to occur? This is probably something you know already too. We know that we need those high energy molecules from the light dependent reactions, and we said those were NADPH and ATP, and we need CO2. So you actually know a lot about the light independent reactions of photosynthesis, and you probably didn't realize that. So we'll look at this again, or we'll look at this a little bit more in some upcoming slides, but this is kind of a nice little summary of the light independent reactions. So as you know, the light independent reactions of photosynthesis are occurring in the stroma of the chloroplast. So up to this point, everything that we've talked about has been occurring in the lumen. The high energy molecules that were created during the light-dependent reaction, the ATP and the NADPH, are now available here in the stroma and allowing those reactants to be available for the Calvin cycle to occur. So another thing that we need for the Calvin cycle to occur is CO2. So I want you to think about the knowledge that you have about the leaf structure and the organization of the leaf, and think about how CO2 would be made available in the stroma. So now let's look at the reaction and how we think about the reaction occurring. We say it's occurring in 3 different stages. Stage 1 is fixation of carbon dioxide. So we have CO2 from the atmosphere, and this CO2 is fixed or attached to this 5-carbon sugar skeleton called RUBP. There is an enzyme called rubisco that facilitates this reaction. So there's a this enzyme rubisco that allows RUBP and CO2 to associate, that creates this temporary 6-carbon molecule. And it's a temporary molecule because it's an unstable molecule. And the 6-carbon molecule that's created from this RUBP and CO2 almost immediately splits into 2 3-carbon molecules called 3-phosphoglycerate. In the next step of the Calvin cycle, that 3-phosphoglycerate is reduced. So we use some of those high energy molecules to phosphorylate and reduce 3-phosphoglycerate. And here's a little surprise. This is our first and most important product of the Calvin cycle, something called 1G3P. So G3P is not really sugar, is it? We say that the product of photosynthesis is glucose, fructose, etc., but actually the first fixed carbon that the plant will produce from this process is G3P. Okay, so that will go on to all kinds of different metabolic processes and be made into sugars and etc., etc., etc. So G3P, it's a 3-carbon molecule. However, we still need to go through another part of the Calvin cycle. We have to go through regeneration. So remember, in this process, we started with this 5-carbon RUBP. We have to get back our 5-carbon RUBP. So there's a whole series of reactions that I won't get into. You'll learn about those when you take biochemistry, that are responsible for regenerating RUBP. So RUBP can be available for to fix carbon dioxide as the cycle continues. So in the Calvin cycle, we go through fixation, reduction, regeneration. And then our high energy molecules, we no longer have those anymore. We've used up the high energy state of those molecules. We have NADP plus and ADP. Those molecules will go back into the system of the light-dependent reactions. So what are our outcomes of photosynthesis? And I like these two equations a little bit better than the equation that we started with. So instead of looking at just one simplified equation, I think it actually benefits students to look at this as two processes that are interconnected, but standalone processes. So in this first equation, we have water and NADP plus and ADP plus PI, and I could have sunlight here, right? Will yield oxygen and NADPH and ATP as our high energy molecules. So that's our light dependent. And then in our light independent, we use those high energy molecules and CO2, and we get sugar and NADP plus and ADP to go back into the process. This is a nice little table that talks about the process and where it's occurring. I would encourage you to be able to recreate that table. And then here's our specific learning outcomes. I hope that you understand that photosynthesis is a process that's occurring in the chloroplast. It's divided into 2 sets. And that we know that the water molecule is split and that oxygen is generated from this process. And I hope you understand why the water molecule is split in the process, so we can get those electrons back into the non-cyclic light reaction. You should know the products of the light reaction and the light independent reaction. You should be able to take a cross-section of the thylakoid membrane and diagram those key protein complexes along there. You should be able to describe the 3 phases of the Calvin cycle, talk about the rubisco enzyme and how it's important to that process, and then know the reactants and products of the light independent reaction. All right, this will wrap up our video series for photosynthesis. Don't forget, you still have a tic-tac-toe and all kinds of additional resources available for photosynthesis in the photosynthesis folder, and then of course contact me if you need more additional support.